No participation. Okay. Okay, welcome you all to tonight's leadership and decision-making class. I hope you all are sitting someplace cool. I just checked the outdoor temperature here at Ruston a few minutes ago. It's like 104 in the shade, so it's like if you wanted August weather, I guess we're already there. My question is, what's going to happen in August? How do we top this? Hopefully we don't top it. Hopefully we go in the other extreme. For tonight, I've got a brief presentation, and then I should say relatively brief presentation, and then some online activities for you all to take a look at. Unfortunately, we're one of the classes that still meets 4th of July week. Hopefully this video format, for those of you that have family plans during that week, hopefully this accommodates you so you get what you need out of class and still spend some quality time with family and or friends. So we'll get started on this and talk a little bit about leadership traits and skills and kind of break some of this down. There's a lot of jargon in this particular chapter that we'll go over, and some of the things that we'll try to clarify tonight with respect to some of the definitions and some of the meanings of things. And I'm guessing if you had an organizational psych class, if you had Psychology 513, there might have been a few things in here that were kind of already familiar. So hopefully, if that's the case, we'll expand on those things a little bit. So based on popular request, what I did was I started adding the study objectives to the chapter, or to the, I'm sorry, from the chapter for the presentation. So after studying this chapter and after some of the things we're going to discuss tonight, you should be able to understand or have some basic understanding about how leader traits and skills relate to effective leadership. Some of the stuff gets kind of interesting, and I'll kind of take a break somewhere towards the middle of this and talk a little bit about some of the things I learned at PSCY this year with respect to, you know, when we're measuring certain types of personality characteristics. The conventional thinking used to be that more is better. That is, there was like a direct linear relationship between some types of personality characteristics and effective leadership or other things. And now we learn that in some situations we can hit a point of diminishing returns where more isn't always better. I'll give you a quick example of that with, and I might have mentioned this before, with cognitive ability. Cognitive ability has kind of a curvilinear relationship with effective leadership. Now, again, we're talking about effective leadership. Keep in mind that there's all kinds of different definitions of leadership. In the video activity for this week, the first video I want you all to take a look at is commentary on, you know, so many theories and which one is right. Well, you know, at this point we could say it depends on what the situation is, how you want to define leader, how you want to define effective outcomes, things like that, how you want to measure some of the stuff. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, cognitive ability. The general trend is that cognitive ability becomes sort of, it's effective up to about 2 standard deviations above the mean, or to put that in IQ terms, it predicts well up to about an IQ of about 130, possibly 145, but certainly after that point, something happens where more intelligence isn't always going to predict who's likely to be an effective leader. And that's not to say that people with high IQs can't lead. I mean, basically what happens in a lot of situations with it, or what happens with a lot of that research, is not that it says that people can't lead after, you know, above an IQ 130 or 145. It's just that the ability to predict on the basis of IQ kind of falls apart. So if you look at how that would be portrayed with a scatter plot, it's like the scatter plot just starts to go all over the place. The types of research methods used to study leadership traits and skills, or study leadership period. Again, you know, what is it we're trying to look at, and how is it that we can either define leadership outcomes, leadership effectiveness, and what's available to measure. Okay. And by measure, psychology, we use all kinds of different types of measures. I mean, we could do something where we're actually counting and tallying up how often behaviors occur, to administering questionnaires and getting people's perceptions about what actually got done or what kind of behaviors occurred. So some of it, you know, with respect to measurement, there is an exact perfect way of doing it. So we have all these different methods, and hopefully, if the theory is correct, what's going to happen is that the results are going to lead in the same direction. Now, last week we took a look at the two meta-analyses, and that's part of what a meta-analysis does, is takes all the different types of studies that are out there, puts them on a common metric where we're reporting the direction and the strength of the finding. In other words, did it support the theory? Did it not support the theory? If it did, how strong was that finding? And then tries to summarize that to say, okay, within all this research, here's basically what we're finding, and here's, you know, looking across all the research, this is what is supported and what isn't supported. Understand what traits and skills are relevant for effective leadership, as we'll get to talking a little bit here. Different traits or different characteristics can be different in effective in different situations. And then one of the things we'll take a look at, we talked about this before, is that sometimes a small entrepreneurial organization, different characteristics or traits are going to be needed for small entrepreneurial organization that might be ineffective in a large organization, and vice versa. Now, with respect to traits, we're going to, if you had a class with Jerry Tabachik, he talked about traits as being a stable characteristic of individuals. Where do the traits come from? And probably the best way of explaining that is we can refer to something called the epigenetic model. I'm going to slide, rotate the camera a little bit. Now, if you've had class with me before, I might have talked a little bit about this idea of epigenetic. Not to be confused with genetic. I'm not saying that leadership, I certainly don't believe this, that leadership is something people are born with. But with the epigenetic model, the idea is that it is going to be heredity. Heredity influences some things, maybe 20 to 40% of what we are. Tillman Sheets would say more. I kind of think, yeah, I think it influences. I don't think it's that determinative. So heredity times environment. And so what kind of environment you're raised in, what are some of the influences? The one thing I can tell you about environment and how it influences what people are not capable of is that if people aren't exposed to certain things, they might not realize there's a possibility. So for those of you who are like me, first generation college student, you know, initially it might have been a little bit more difficult because you hadn't been exposed to that. And so consequently, you know, developing some kind of frame of reference and figuring out what was going to be effective and not effective, a little bit more difficult versus a family where, let's say, the parents were teachers or college teachers or engineers or you know, some occupational area that required education, and you kind of get a lot of that indirectly in terms of thinking, okay, here's the environment, here's what the possibilities are. The other part of this, unique experience. I'm sorry. That should be a U, not an I. Long day, long hot day. Unique experience. So, you know, even within the same environment, people are going to have sort of different vantage points with respect to what they experience or how that kind of influences them. Now, a quick example of unique experiences, you could have people who are two identical twins. In other words, same genes, same environment, but if you noted, identical twins, or I know a family that has identical triplets, they're different people. And certainly by age 14, 15, 16, you start to see that where they kind of gravitate towards things differently. Well, part of that is they're not all standing in the same spot. So, you know, think about something like that in terms of a small effect where, you know, just standing in the same spot or not standing in the same spot is going to affect your perceptions. It could indirectly, you want to use the term butterfly effects, the butterfly effects that would occur in your life. I'm not stating this obviously in scientific purposes, but, you know, minor little variations could influence who you become. In other words, things are pretty wide open, and part of this would say if we could identify some of these things, you know, we could certainly say, okay, somebody that has X proportion of a certain kind of heredity and probably all over the map in terms of genetic combinations, the right kind of environment and the right kind of unique experiences could become a leader. Well, with respect this and this, we can control that a whole lot more than that, right? And, you know, part of this too, if we're going to develop people as leaders within organizations, this and this would come a lot, because those are the things we control. So relevant for effective leadership. Anytime you hear the term effective leadership, somebody says, yeah, somebody's an effective leader, or something relates to effective leadership, the first thing, you know, you should ask is, what's the situation, what kind of organization, and how are you defining effective leadership? So, you know, quick flash forward on that. We could define effective leadership in terms of somebody who's really good taskmaster at getting things done, but that leadership might not translate over into other environments. We talked last week about environments where you had better educated subordinate employees who really do their jobs, and consequently, if you're taskmaster, that might not work as well. On the other hand, one of the ways you might define effective leadership in that situation is whether or not people are working together as cohesive teams if that's needed, whether or not people are satisfied and committed to the work they're doing. So we'll get into some of those details there. Relevance of trait and skill depends on the situation. So that's what I was alluding to right there, is that what are the traits or what are the skills in terms of what's going to control how effective somebody is going to depend on the context in which you're defining leadership or how you're defining leadership. Because again, it's part of the problem with doing any of the research here is there is not one single universally agreed upon definition of what constitutes leadership. Traits and skills that can cause some people to derail managerial careers. Some cases, things that we would even see as being positives could cause people to derail their managerial careers. Or another example, this could cause them to derail that environment in which they're leading in terms of making some kind of gains. Understanding the limitations of trait approaches. So part of what happens with trait approaches, and this is something you're going to find consistent across that research area, is that a lot of times what they're doing is they're saying, okay, we have data that says that this trait is related to successful leadership outcomes in a specific situation. But the problem is a lot of times those types of theories or those types of research findings don't all say how this occurs, just that it occurs. So leader traits and skills related to an effective leader. So we're talking about traits. Basically, we're going to be talking about or referencing something that, again, is kind of a stable characteristic that people possess. Values, have to do with people's orientations towards things. Self-concepts, how do people picture themselves? How do they picture themselves relative to others? Skill is going to be kind of an interaction where you're looking at the ability to make something happen, the ability to get something done. And then competencies. Somebody have the ability within a situation to affect some kind of outcome because of some kind of know-how or some type of ability to exercise multiple skills that they might possess. So some of the growing areas: emergent leadership, leadership advancement, and leadership effectiveness, or ways of discussing leadership effectiveness. Now, again, some of the research is going to depend on how we're going to define leadership and how we're going to define effectiveness. So historically, and if you look at some of the videos that are in that viewing activity, a little bit of historical context in terms of of how our modern ways of picturing leadership came about. A lot of this coming from late 19th century through early 20th century people who were studying this. And the definition of effective is going to, again, it's going to vary in terms of the situation and what we need to have people doing and what unit of analysis we're looking at. Values, flashback to that for a minute, the idea that, these are how people orient towards things, internalize attitudes towards things, right or wrong, moral, how people picture morality, how people picture integrity, things like that. A lot of this will also come back to whether or not people are consistent with their beliefs with respect to the values. Some other things I think, let's see, the text talked about pragmatism and whether people could be practical. Things like civility. I think, one of the things that we're hearing a lot about lately is that civility is kind of being lost in public discourse. I'm kind of thinking I see a lot of that when I look at the stuff that people will post online anymore, that was kind of disappearance with, what's happening with values. The other ideas here, self-concepts, identities, things like that. We can bounce back to the previous slide. Self-concepts. So, how people picture themselves in relation to others, what they think is worthwhile to achieve. People sometimes intrinsically motivated and will maintain consistency. And part of that is how they're picturing, people are picturing themselves. And then let's see, skilled. When I'm talking about job analysis, usually refer to skill as being somewhat different. So I'll talk about skills being something where you're applying something, and using a psychomotor component. Well, in that context, when you're doing job analysis, we would say, okay, skill would be something like driving a car. But, going back to that epigenetic model, this idea that it's kind of learning and heredity, and some of the things that often get referred to, cognitive complexity, ability to abstract, and intelligence and interpersonal abilities, how we interact with others. That last term, competency, traits and skills, competencies often combine the two. So in other words, this is what I was saying before, we have multiple skills and kind of using your skills with what you have, the traits. And let me stop with the traits for a minute. The idea with the traits is that everybody might have slightly different traits, so we could have a situation in which two people that have a lot of different characteristics could be similarly effective in the same type of leadership role based on, let's say, having good self-knowledge, good effective self-concepts, and being able to use their traits perhaps differently. I'll give you a quick example. I've seen people who are introverts and extroverts succeed just as effective in the same situation, and it had to do with their skills with respect to knowing how and when to apply what it was that they had. So having competencies, and some of the competencies we talked about, the competency with respect related to people, business acumen would be an example of a competency. Competency with reading markets and things like that. Those would be examples of things that would be competencies that would relate to being effective leader. Yeah, somehow I'm going to read down to the bottom of this. Okay, so some of the types of research, emergent leadership. Emergent leadership a lot of times looks at who's likely to, let's say, have a higher trajectory with respect to stepping into a leadership role. Times when I've worked in situations where we try to apply emergent leadership. In Chapter 6, they talk about assessment centers, specifically AT&T's assessment centers. One of the things that happens with let me just stop on assessment center. Assessment center is not a place, it's more of a technique. And what happens with assessment centers is you'll put people through multiple exercises or activities where usually you're trying to let's say, score all those activities together to see who's most likely to succeed in a given situation. And then one of the activities that I've witnessed over the last couple of decades is something called the emergent leader activity. That a lot of times this is done by putting together people in a group within this assessment center and then giving them some kind of team-related activity, and then watching who effectively or becomes the leader within the group. Now, sometimes people are expecting leadership to be defined a certain way, and they'll step up and they'll start to become the taskmaster. When I saw this stuff done at the General Electric Assessment Center in Brookville, Alabama last time, they were looking for were people that were social facilitator types, because they'd already studied the managerial situations they're going to put people into, and have discovered that people that were social facilitators, people that were like encouragers and team captains, tended to be better within those situations. Leadership advancement, people that are likely to move things ahead. One of the areas of research, and then current leadership effectiveness. Again, this is kind of opening things up and saying, we can't look at this like, if you see the video viewing activity, Frederick Taylor or Max Weber, we're trying to specialize. We're trying to break it down simply that, we're in a different era and different ways of defining, describing what is and what is not effective with respect to leadership. The different types of studies that we would have. Comparison studies. So a lot of these studies kind of focused around looking at people who were leaders or managers and then comparing them to people who weren't leaders or managers. Sometimes the text used the book critical incidents. What a critical instance is those situations where you have something that doesn't come up all the time on the job, but when it does, it's kind of a make or break situation. So part of this, looking either through comparative studies or observations, looking at the way that people that were effective in terms of resolving an outcome or leading other people or planning, leading, and organizing and controlling the work of others could resolve the situation with some kind of critical instance. Now, comparison studies. Again, in terms of who you're looking at as a leader, a lot of different ways of defining that. So you're not always going to be able to say that, we have one definition of this and we can compare people that are leaders to people that are not leaders. And in some cases, that's kind of what leads to the inconclusive results, or making sure that whatever we're saying as a result is something where it's situations. Now, laboratories, we can set up. We can create simulations and situations where we can see who's likely to lead or what's likely to be effective in some situations. Laboratories, a lot of times you're going to infer that what's going on is going to be true experimental research. And if it's true experimental research, the advantage to that is if we can identify, well, basically we can, in terms of what we can do, we can control the entire environment. So if we can find some kind of cause and effect relationship, we can make a causal attribution, just say, okay, if the person led this way or did this and led to a successful outcome, then we know that behavior or that competency or whatever it was led to the outcome and hence effective, what we call effective leadership. And then observation, direct behavioral observation. So, give an example of some of the studies where this has been done. People sometimes doing case studies, or people actually doing studies where they're going to count what's going on. That is, they're going to look directly at behaviors and outcomes. And it kind of works, but again, if you're going into some kind of applied setting, you're not really controlling everything. You could find relationships, but you're not necessarily going to know if they're causal relationships. Some of the things that came out of these studies, though, in terms of what would predict an emergent leader. Things like energy. And here's something to think about. The two things that kind of come out of a lot of the studies are that people that are leaders tend to have high energy and at least high level leaders, high energy and stress tolerance. So if you wanted to characterize these people, a lot of times these people are going to be calm and confident. In a lot of situations, we're looking at interpersonal skills, or the person having, some kind of, let's say, a self-concept where they understand their own strengths and limitations. And that's one of the things that, if you probably noticed with people that were effective leaders, was that, these people weren't always perfect people, and, a lot of times they're aware of what their flaws, what their strengths and their weaknesses were. With respect to interpersonal communications, I think one of the things I remember hearing about early career, or people asking me when I was a young IO psychologist, was, can you interface with upper level management? And my answer to that, based on experiences, was yeah, because those people are usually the easiest people to talk to. So, research methods, leadership advancement, longitudinal look across time to see what happens, whether or not people are on a fast trajectory upward moving, their careers develop real quickly, or do they derail the organizational work? Survey research. So asking people what they're doing, what's happening. Now, limitation of survey research is we're basically looking at something where it's self-report. And part of what can happen with self-report or surveys is you don't also have behavioral, attitudinal consistency. So people might see things one way when in fact they're not quite seeing how things really are. But just the same, it's going to yield some kind of useful data, even if it has that kind of limitation. So traits and skills that are effective. Again, depending on what the leadership situation is, but some of the things that usually come up as being areas that are relevant for leaders, some of the traits, again, that idea of high energy and stress tolerance. And let me give you an example. With the people that get elected to public office, our state representatives or our federal representatives, one of the things I think you could say that characterizes most of those people is high energy. Like them or not, I think that's one of the consistent things we're going to see across people that are in that kind of office. The other thing, this idea of being kind of stress tolerant. So, if you think about what people in leadership or management positions often have to do, is, I've said this before, where they have to make some pretty hard and fast decisions that could have a whole lot of impact and have to do it with limited data or information. In other words, looking for somebody that can do something like that and be comfortable with it. And that's not all of us, or that's not all of us in all situations. If you're looking at, and when I said there was kind of a curvilinear relationship with some things, with the big five, you had a class with Tomacic. You might have talked about conscientiousness, and we've discovered that conscientiousness is kind of curvilinear. That is, people that are too high in conscientiousness aren't also going to be effective leaders. Now, one of the reasons that happens is that if the subordinates don't do their work, the highly conscientious people will start doing the work for them. The people that are, maybe on the high side of conscientiousness but not extreme are going to push back on the subordinates and make them do the work. The other thing that can happen with conscientiousness, too, is that people that are too high conscientious often are going to have trouble making some kind of hard and fast decision when they have limited information, because they're going to want to be precise or exact. The idea of stress tolerance, and part of this is, the idea that people that are tolerant to stress are going to tend to be consistent across situations. And part of, if you think about this just sort of rationally, part of leading people, part of moving people forward is going to be this idea, or a part of it is going to be consistent with whatever you're communicating to people, whatever you're trying to get them to do. So the idea of being emotionally stable and consistent seems to be effective in a lot of situations. Energy level, stress tolerance, self-confidence. If you think about what happens with self-confidence too, are you likely to follow somebody who isn't self-confident? The other thing that happens with self-confidence is people are more likely to take predictable risks, more likely to take chances, more likely to reach out to others. So there's a whole lot of things, with respect to that self-confidence that could influence the effectiveness of people. Now, again, in most situations, self-confidence, however, if self-confidence goes to the extreme, if it becomes something like narcissism, or people are way too self-confident past what they should be and don't have a good, good sense of self, it could cause problems. Internal locus of control, if you had social psychology, you might have talked about this. The idea of internal locus of control has to do with, to put this in plain psychological language, has to do with how you assign or attribute causes. So the person who is external with respect to locus of control, it's going to be somebody who thinks that it pictures the world from the perspective of it's not them, it's the environment. So the extreme example of that is when somebody says, don't make me have to hit you again, right? In other words, that's a little bit different than, I chose to strike you even though I knew it was wrong. In other words, you didn't do it, I didn't do it. Or I didn't do it, you did it. The other thing that you'll see with people that have high external locus of control, especially in the extremes, they think it's the environment, they think everything is luck, they think they don't have any real control over life. Now, if you kind of look at what happens with that, and as I previously mentioned, human beings tend to be control freaks. So if that locus of control becomes pathologically external, chances are you're looking at somebody who's either clinically depressed or could become clinically depressed because they feel like they have no control over everything. Internal locus of control, where you're kind of saying, okay, what I did is the results of my own thinking and my choosing, and that I have control over my outcomes. And that's most of us. For people that are in college and grad school, you kind of had at least an average with respect to internal locus of control, average to high average minimum. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing this. You wouldn't feel like you could be successful. Now, where this can become pathological is if somebody becomes so delusional that they think that they can control, the environment or the world or people around them with telepathy. That'd be an example of pathological internal locus of control. But basically, we're going to say people can lead and people can plan and organize and control the work of others. To be able to do that, they have to feel like they can control things, or that they have control over outcomes, or certainly have some kind of control over themselves. Emotional stability and maturity. Again, this idea of being consistent across situations. That emotional stability kind of interacts with the stress tolerance. So in other words, you don't overreact to things, you're kind of calm, and when problems occur, you're able to put things in perspective and come up with some kind of way of dealing with problem situations or difficulty. And then last one, power motivation. Well, to a certain degree, people want to have some kind of power. We'll talk a little bit about the differences in this power. We'll talk about something called McClellan's needs, or some of this comes down to what kind of power do you want to have, and what motivates you to have the power. So, flip the slide. Personal integrity. And, in some ways, looking at this from the perspective of kind of increases the credibility, right? Somebody who has a lot of personal integrity can kind of create an atmosphere of fairness, to borrow some terms from psych 513, justice of some kind, distributive justice, procedural justice, kind of explain those quickly. If, let's say, the process that led to some kind of outcome was seen as being fair, then it would have procedural justice. Now, again, it doesn't matter what the outcome is, just was the process that led to that outcome perceived of as being fair. Distributive justice is when the outcome itself is being perceived of as being fair. So if you kind of think about that, somebody with personal integrity is going to be able to have a lot of perceived as being honest, as being credible, being trustworthy, and consequently, what's going to happen with respect to how people react to them. They're going to get a lot of loyalty, a lot of commitment, and in a lot of complex situations, what's going to happen is that they're going to have highly satisfied subordinate employees, especially if we're talking about organizational setting where you're supervising people that tend to be higher cognitively functioning or higher, more educated, or those situations where you have somebody who's essentially the strategic type manager, and they don't necessarily have the expertise that the subordinates have, so they kind of have to be able to trust the subordinates to do that well. The trust is going to be kind of a two-way street. Narcissism. I think, yeah, narcissism is usually seen as being something kind of negative, where you have people that are self-absorbed, self-obsessed. In the book, they talked about, how one of the theories was that narcissists are created by parents who aren't that engaged and don't give a lot of feedback or a lot of positive reinforcement to their kids. So what happens is kids sort of kind of grow up and trying to create their own, if you want to say, support, or trying to address that need through kind of external validation. And some of the things that happen, as a result of that is these people, at least according to psychological theories, people tend to be kind of self-aggrandizing, tend to lack empathy, tend to surround themselves with the plain English term is yes men. Well, yes men are women. Basically, people who are going to be agreeable, people who aren't going to challenge them, people who aren't going to question them. These are people that are also likely to overstate what they're capable of or set goals that are too high. A lot of times these are going to be people that aren't really going to have a plan in terms of how to achieve something. They're going to have perhaps a vision, and then a lot of the vision, involving self-aggrandizement and again, kind of manipulating or using people to get to that end. Now, interestingly enough, this has worked in some situations. I think the text talked about people that were in the software or information technology industries with some of the startups. This has worked. One of the questions I'd ask here is, a lot of times Steve Jobs is seen as being a charismatic leader, a visionary leader. Is it possible that he may have also been a little bit of a narcissist? Okay. In addition to being somebody who's charismatic. And having said that, I think one of the things we could say too is that we can't also characterize the leader in one specific way, that a lot of times it's going to be a lot of characteristics. However, I think some of the research out there tends to indicate that eventually narcissistic leaders could derail situations and cause problems for organizations. Achievement orientation and need for affiliation. McClellan, early 1960s, talked about these things. That part of what happens with people that, okay, let's go totally circular reasoning on this. When people achieve things, it's because they have a need for achievement, or they have an achievement orientation. So if you took that achievement orientation, that need to make things happen, need to meet goals and outcomes, need to change or improve things, and put that with the need for affiliation, the need to be accepted by others, the need to have social interaction, the need to be appreciated, things like that. You put the two of those together, and that could lead, in a lot of situations, to a pretty good leadership outcome. So being liked or being accepted, and then tying that to your need or motivation to make things happen. If you Google McClelland, you're going to see this presented in a lot. You'll see examples where this is presented in a lot of detail. Where there's also a negative side to this, where if people have, let's say, a need for power where it's coercive and controlling power, that can also that can lead to being effective in some situations, but overall it can kind of derail what the leader is trying to accomplish. Now, if you had class with Jerry Tamachi, we talked about these characteristics. So some of the things that, if you want to say, relate to leadership, again, we could say that these things are always going to be direct and linear. Sometimes they're going to be curvilinear. So on the big five, extroversion. Okay, so either extroversion or the other way this could play out is that you can have people that are introverted but like that kind of behavior. But higher scores of extroversion. I think we should give him a chance. A little bit more personal. A little bit more special. If you're thinking about this like social situations.
Go back. I want to see local conscientiousness. But I also think if you look like China has
somebody's going to
be cheap these deals, and we're just going to act like, you know, it's important. And Donald Trump's credit, nobody else was really going to talk about that until he came on the scene. And he's the perfect of it on this. So I don't know or not.
Okay. So conscientiousness, are people going to see things through, are people going to be fairly consistent with respect to making things happen, to making outcomes happen? Conscientiousness, again, can work in some leadership situations. However, again, people that are too conscientious often aren't effective leaders in many situations, because if the work doesn't get done, they're not going to push back on the subordinates. And again, perhaps in some cases having trouble making difficult decisions with limited information because of the probability of being wrong. But, you know, basically with conscientious people, these are things where you're going to say that, okay, these people can be characterized as being dependable and having integrity. And to go back to that McClellan's need for achievement, this is going to be related to that need to achieve things. Openness to learning or openness to experience in situations where, especially if it's like a learning organization, you need people that are going to be able to recognize what works and what doesn't work. Now, with respect to this particular characteristic, one of the things that characterizes a lot of the economic activity in the 21st century is that people are often moving into niche markets or moving into things and using processes that haven't been used before. So it's like you're going into new territory, and consequently, what would could make a person effective in a leadership capacity or managerial capacity was the ability to accept new experiences and to be able to learn and figure out what the patterns are, and keep improving with respect to their whatever it is that they keep improving their knowledge set and keep improving their skill sets. Now, neuroticism. If you're looking at this using that acronym OCEAN, neuroticism would be the one scale where it would be better if people didn't, or people would score lower in this area. And this is the one that's going to be related to stress tolerance and comfort with ambiguous situations. So, having said that, with, you know, unless we're talking about a bureaucratic organization, a lot of organizations are going to be operating in pretty ambiguous situations. So in other words, like a Google or a Yahoo, or to a certain degree Apple computers or an Amazon, they're constantly changing what it is they're doing to respond to forces external to the environment, and consequently, you know, to be able to be comfortable with that, or to be able to lead in those situations, you would expect people to be low in neuroticism. That would be advantageous. These are kind of some interesting sets here. You know, technical skills, interpersonal skills, and conceptual skills. And, you know, these are going to be kind of different with respect to what is the organization like. So one of the questions we could ask here, does it take a different type of leader or manager in a small entrepreneurial organization than it does in a large established organization that already has established some kind of market share? And the answer to that is, yeah, it does. Now, technical skills in plain English, what are we talking about here? If we want to simplify that, the idea is, the knowledge of how things get done. Interpersonal skills, we could talk about this in terms of feelings and attitudes towards others, how we communicate with others, whether or not we're able to communicate effectively with, and this is the term that gets used, this wasn't in the text, but this is one of the terms that get used, are we able to effectively communicate with diverse groups of others? And if you think about like a 21st century workplace, you've got increasingly diverse group of people. So interpersonal skills are, going to be somewhat of a determinant to a big determinant, depending on what the leadership situation is. Conceptual skills, so that idea of being able to engage in the abstract reasoning, analytical, logical problem solving. There's another term I'll throw out here too. It's something called cognitive complexity. So, if you've talked about cognitive ability before, that's one kind of characteristic that looks at things like spatial orientation or whether you're able to solve certain types of reasoning problems. But cognitive complexity is and the way this is typically defined is these people that can look at a lot of information and say, okay, all the stuff that's going on here comes down to one or two or three simple rules. And if you look at these in terms of what happens within organizations, it's a bit of a trade-off here. In other words, if we're talking about the small entrepreneurial organization, it might be a bigger weight on technical skills than there are on interpersonal skills or conceptual skills. In other words, you're going to do that kind of business startup. Chances, well, with most business startups, it's somebody that knew something about an area. They knew something about engineering. They knew something about some kind of product or how to produce some kind of food or some kind of service. So they have a lot of technical skills. And the idea was to get out there, use a little bit of interpersonal skills, and start marketing things. Well, as that organization starts to grow and becomes like a Fortune 500 company, this will kind of flip. In other words, you're not looking for somebody that has a lot of technical skills. You're looking for somebody that has the good interpersonal skills, but has better conceptual skills and perhaps has the strategic management skills. So has the ability to take a look at the big picture and then figure out what the course of action should be. And previously I've talked about Les Geis as being representative of this and this, where again, Les Geis is a well-skilled engineer. So if he was just going to lead an engineering department, he would have that. Now, leading the university, technical skills related to engineering don't quite matter as much as the conceptual skills or the strategic management skills. Now, the other question again, if we're going to look at this in terms of small businesses versus large businesses, to get things set up and on a growth trajectory, the technical skills might be very useful. If we're talking about maintaining market share, I think we had this conversation previously. We talked about large organizations. I'll give an example like a CenturyLink or perhaps a General Motors or an AT&T, some of those organizations where they already have a pretty stable market share and not likely to increase it by leaps and bounds. So consequently, what they need, and I'll throw a term out here that isn't in the text, to maintain their cash cow status, that is to be economically viable and to grow in terms of the limits that an established organization can grow in versus the rapid growth of an entrepreneurial organization, is that they have to become more efficient. So they have to look inwards and come up with different concepts and different strategies for making that organization more efficient, and then come up with different concepts and strategies for either hanging on to that market share or trying to increase that market share. I'm going to say incrementally, versus an entrepreneurial organization. When business startups tend to grow, if they're going to be successful, tend to grow exponentially. So, does somebody know what it takes to get things done within some kind of specific product production or producing some kind of food product or producing, delivering some kind of service. Interpersonal skills, again, both inside and outside the organization, tend to be somewhat necessary, or higher levels tend to be somewhat necessary. But again, as that organization becomes large and more complex, the conceptual skills in dealing with the dynamics of the marketplace, of the customer base, the conceptual skills and strategic management skills become more and more important. Go back to that concept of cognitive complexity again. The idea with that is cognitive ability, intelligence, cognitive complexity. Can somebody take a look at a lot of information and say that, okay, I see all this complex stuff happening here, but let me simplify it. And kind of what I've been told by people that have been, worked in leadership-related areas was that there are different types of tests that are out there where we can assess whether or not people possess that cognitive complexity, and they predict well. Now, again, with any of these things we consider sort of trait theories, a lot of times nobody's put together why these things would work other than, kind of rationally, intuitively, people would say, okay, well, it makes sense that conscientious people would make better leaders in some situations. And I think that idea that, okay, this is curvilinear, that kind of makes sense with that's sort of an explanation, but nobody's really done anything to determine whether or not the explanation actually holds a lot of sway in the long run. Emotional intelligence, kind of a popular concept or construct for a while, and it's still used by some organizations. My take on this, and I think I've said this before, is that emotional intelligence doesn't look like it's any one thing. What it looks like is it's a combination of already existing characteristics and traits. Now, having said that, would I use some kind of measure of emotional intelligence if I was selecting people for managerial roles or leadership positions? And my take on that, because I'm kind of an applied person, is that sometimes I'm not always interested whether or not it's good science, but does it predict? In other words, if somebody told me, had some kind of measure of emotional intelligence, and again, this is getting at how people interact, how people view themselves, how people respond in different types of situations, whether or not people have social awareness. If somebody had some kind of measure that tended to predict well, I don't care if it's a single construct, if it's measuring emotional intelligence as a trait, or whether it's actually measuring, 3 or 4 other things. As long as it predicts, and somebody can show me some data that predicts, and then later, after I use that measure and follow up on it and do a criterion study, that is, I'm going to take and see whether or not scores or whether or not that characteristic predicts differences in leadership, just to make sure that it was consistent with the previous use. I'm not really going to care. Social intelligence, how do people interact with others? How do people, kind of self-monitor, put them in situations? And again, higher level leaders, this tends to be a little bit more important. With these types of competencies, you would expect somebody in an entrepreneurial organization to have some of this. They don't necessarily have to be as strong with this as people in upper level organizations. And then the ability to learn. And, I think any good higher level manager or leader is going to openly admit that they don't know everything. And that they're constantly learning. And of course, in the 21st century workplace, or let's say a 21st century organization where you're dealing with a private or for-profit organization where you're dealing with changes within a customer base, that's going to be necessary. That nobody's going to have everything they need, or nobody's going to walk into that job halfway. So, kind of reflect on that. Back in the 60s, there was something called the Peter Principle that would get discussed, and the Peter Principle was this idea that people would rise to their maximum level of competence. And it was kind of said jokingly, but if you look at what happens in the 21st century, the organizations are expanding into areas and doing things that haven't been done before. So, how would you expect anybody to step into some kind of situation and be perfectly confident from day one? The other thing I could say about that too is that, with respect to how we're developing people, what's happening with career tracks, and while this discussion of leadership and what creates leaders, or how can we facilitate people becoming leaders. Again, we have this sort of demographic problem going on. We have more people turning 65 than 18. And the effect of that I've seen, with respect to organizational leaders and managers, is that a lot of times the person who's coming in as to take something over or emerging as the manager in their mid to late 20s or early 30s, they're replacing somebody that had 20 or 30 years to develop into that role. So with respect, to looking at a lot of this stuff, I think leadership studies become more important because of a fast changing dynamic economy, changes in technology and processes and procedures, and then changes in demographics, where part of that's affecting the customer base, and that the customers are changing, so they're going to want things differently, but also internally in the organization that we don't have the same kind of workforce, that we have fewer young people coming up, and consequently we have to rethink how we're doing some of these things, and certainly look at what it takes to develop people in leadership and management positions, and not thinking, okay, what we'll do is we'll just put them in a lower level job and we'll expect them to develop over that. Let's see. Fourth objective here. The relevance of the trait depends on the situation. So again, we say a review of the literature. A lot of times that's going to imply that meta-analysis, somebody go out there and tally all this stuff up and see what the directions of the findings were. Leader with certain traits can be effective in one situation, but be ineffective in a different situation. And the example I was giving previously, this idea of we have entrepreneurial organizations, business startups, and that takes perhaps one set of traits or characteristics or competencies, and then as that organization grows and becomes an organization where they have perhaps a significant market share at a national level, that's a different set of competencies. I think previously we talked too about Winston Churchill and the movie Our Darkest Hour. I saw that recently, and it kind of, I think it sets a good example of this, where somebody's effective in one situation but not in another situation. Dwight Eisenhower gets mentioned once in a while too, that is like a low-level commander who wasn't effective, but then look what happened with the invasion of Omaha Beach. So the other thing that could happen too is that two leaders with different patterns of traits could be successful in the same situation. So I'm going to throw out a term that isn't in the text. It's the term is equifinality. So EQUIFINALITY, equifinality. To put that in plain English, to use a bad old metaphor, there's more than one way to skin the cat. Never been real clear on why people were trying to skin the cat. But yeah, different combinations of traits and characteristics could lead to being successful in similar situations, in the same situations. And kind of what that suggests is that if you think about what it takes to be an effective leader, it's not necessarily one thing, as they thought historically, going back into like the 19th century, where people were either born leaders or not born leaders, or to go back even further than that. Thomas Hobbes in the 16th century writes this book called Leviathan. Leviathan basically is a work that justifies royalty, not on the basis of divine right like it had been during, going from the Roman era forward, but the basis of creating social order, and then makes the implication that that people that are in royal families, or people that are in the the quote unquote better families, were naturally born that way. Well, kind of looking at this, and that's no longer the situation. Now, going back to the epigenetic model, yeah, heredity could control some of this. Maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe 40%, but then it was the other proportion that where, we're looking at environment, we're looking at unique experience, and perhaps we're looking at people that might have completely different patterns of traits or different competencies, depending on how they use those competencies, could be affected in the same situation. Now, with the example with the NEO2, with the big five, extroversion is probably better. But having said that, there's a lot of introverted people that can engage in the behavior where they're seen as having good emotional stability and good interpersonal skills, where they'll be able to lead people, or more importantly, people want to follow them. So some of the relevancies here. We're talking managerial level, we're talking like a quote-unquote supervisor, or we're talking like somebody that would be characterized as being a leader. And those would be different types of skill sets. Give you kind of a quick example. We're going to look within the military. Being a drill sergeant is a completely different skill set than being a general. I'm going to kick out of what is it, the general insurance commercial, where the cartoon general character is citing some of the chants that they do when they're marching people in basic training. But in reality, no, completely different skill sets. Where one is going to be the person who's going to be the taskmaster, going to be able to control the behavior at a fairly specific micro level, versus the other person who's going to be able to control the big picture. The other part of this too is the interaction with the external environment. So if you're looking at people that are going to be more of the taskmaster type, kind of what you're looking at are the people that are going to be controlling the internal, or working in the organization, and short timeline horizons, and controlling things on a minute-to-minute basis, versus the external environment. You're talking about people that need to be able to lead that organization so it can adapt to changes that are occurring within that external environment. So, and the text uses the term turbulent. Turbulent means that environment is always changing. And that characterizes, I think, just about any kind of environment now in the 21st century. But I would say that maybe not so with the customer base or the external environment the Department of Motor Vehicles works with, but certainly like with a university, with Amazon, with Google, with Walmart, those organizations are existing in a turbulent environment. So we have managers who need more, let's say, new competencies, and need to increase their skill set as time goes on. And we're kind of on what we consider sort of a growth trajectory. Now, some of the things were some of the competencies that work with respect to leading people through turbulent environments. Certainly that cognitive complexity, so you can see the pattern that's going on, cultural sensitivity, and cross-cultural awareness. Being a little bit flexible in terms of your thinking and behavior, the ability to learn from experiences and adapt and change. So if there's one thing we can say that kind of characterizes a lot of the basic things that should happen with situational situations in the 21st century, is this ability to change or adapt based on what's happening within the economy. It's kind of like we're kind of saying, okay, this is sort of like managerial social evolution. Because what does the theory of evolution holds? It holds that the organisms that succeed are the ones that are able to successfully adapt to their environment. Well, if you look at let's say evolution in this kind of a context, we're not talking about people losing their prehensile tails or growing exophthalmos, or I should say growing prehensile tails, anything like that. We're talking about behavioral adaptation. And actually, with the theory of evolution, we're going to look at how animals change to begin with, assuming they don't change physically, it's just the behavior changes. The problem with some of this, though, is it's evolving so quickly that we don't also have specific grounded theory answers. So, traits and skills that cause people to derail in managerial situations. let me back up and talk about trade school. The trade approach came out of this idea of the person who's a born leader, and then of course we move to the 20th century and start defining traits a little bit more specifically. If you had class with George Tabachek, you got into some of those definitions. So we, have studied these things. In some cases, we've looked at how they relate to successful leader outcomes. However, the limitation is going to be with the outcomes, how we're defining outcomes, we're defining what happens with respect to production products, goods, or services. We're defining outcomes in terms of how the subordinates respond, whether or not the subordinates are satisfied, committed, engage in, or have those characteristics that should lead to higher performance for the organization. A lot of the trait studies, again, curvilinear. And this is, in terms of how we looked at things historically, we also looked at, if we had something that we thought was a positive characteristic, we also looked at that as being, or tended to look at that as being straight, linear, that is, more was always better. And of course, the 21st century part of this is we get better able to define what it is we're looking at, but we also have better statistics that can capture some of this stuff and discover that, some things, more is always going to be better. The other thing that hasn't happened is that a lot of times these things are just looked at specifically. In other words, we're going to look at this one trait, we're going to look at this one competency, we're going to look at this one characteristic, and say whether or not it leads to better outcomes. And unfortunately, if we're going to say that, okay, going back to that idea that people that have different levels of traits or different types of characteristics can be effective in the same situation, it kind of implies that we can't look at these things on a single trait or characteristic basis. We have to do is we have to kind of put them all together and see how they fit and interact with each other. So that makes the research questions a little bit more complex to ask. It makes the research design a little bit more complicated. And, in terms of, let's say something like, well, we think that agreeableness is going to work real well for people that are working at high levels, organic organizations where there's a lot of interaction with a turbulent environment. Well, the next question is, how does agreeableness, what levels of agreeableness, and how does that interact with different levels of conscientiousness or different levels of extroversion? On the other hand, want to try to simplify this, like assuming we're going to try to select people for managers. Again, my take on this as an applied person is if I could find something that's simple and predicts. I'm also interested in the science, and I'm also interested in the explanations. But again, if it appears to predict and predict consistently, I might still use it, even if it's some kind of trait or characteristic like emotional intelligence, where I believe, again, that's not measuring one thing, that's measuring characteristics or constructs or traits that already exist. So back on track here. Some of the things that cause people to derail. And the text talks about this primarily in terms of derailing their careers. I'd say when somebody's derailing their career, what's often happening is by implication, derailing the work unit. Now, derailing, could involve work unit effectiveness goes down, where people aren't being as productive. Output, whether it's goods or services, is decreasing or not increasing. But it could also be some indirect things, like, how do the subordinates feel about that? Well, again, if we're going to talk about things like procedural justice, we're going to talk about fairness, we're going to talk about satisfaction and commitment. We could say that satisfaction and commitment don't necessarily mean that we're going to have higher performance. But, if you think about satisfaction and commitment decreasing turnover, by extension, it will have some kind of impact on performance, because basically, if you've got an organization where that organization, or let's say where people need to have some kind of established skill set, you're not going to maintain those people if they're not satisfied or committed. So another way of derailing things where people just don't like the work unit. Now, text doesn't say this, but in terms of could you operate like that, where you're behaving as a leader in some way that dissatisfies people, or people aren't really feeling the commitment? Historically, the answer to that would have been yes. In those times where the job market was tight, people would put up with a whole lot and still perform or produce just to hang on to their job. Again, when you have a situation where you have a decreasing number of workers because there's more people turning 65 than 18, then you're going to have to focus back on some of that. I will jokingly say this to Toddy and Mitzi DeSells about some of that phony baloney O-side stuff, but truth is, that's joking. I honestly believe in that. From my perspective, where I've been working a lot with recruitment selection, all that stuff becomes really important because, okay, you've identified the best performers, you've identified people that fit with that job, whether it's a production level, a supervisory level, an upper level management type position. Now, what are you going to do to bring the best out of them? So managers who derail, less capable of handling pressure. One of the things I've seen people develop over time, and I'm kind of outside looking in on some of this stuff. I mean, I had probably a good total of maybe 8 years where I was the manager of the work unit before I got into academia. And one of the things I saw with other people and actually experienced this myself was becoming more capable at handling pressure and better at dealing with ambiguity. So this can derail a manager. Chances are, by the time somebody gets into upper level management, if there's been some kind of rational process of determining or that people would go through to get there either through promotions or assessment, chances are they're able to handle pressure. But if it's a situation where, let's say, you see a lot of people see people who have a lot of the good qualities, one of the things you can do is help them develop that ability to handle pressure and stay calm. Angry outbursts. Angry outbursts can work perhaps for line supervisors where they're expecting a lot of turnover. Talking to people that were drill instructors, and just to talk, when I was at Auburn, used to talk to some of the drill instructors at Fort Benning and some of the other bases, Fort Rucker and some of the other bases. They actually said that they had to fake angry outbursts and kind of get into character to make that happen. Well, part of what they were doing was, this is what gets kind of interesting. They were engaging in angry outbursts to get the new recruits able to handle pressure, with the idea that the people that really excelled at handling pressure actually might go on to become lieutenant, captain, colonel, or major at some point. But angry outbursts and not being able to control them, especially with other people, is going to be problematic. That can derail managers. And you think about this, especially with a higher educated group of subordinates or people that really do their jobs. This is something you don't want to do. Now, having said that, I have angry outbursts when I was supervising people. Yeah, just not with the people. I just would shut my door and release a few key terms and walk out, maybe calm with everybody. Inconsistent behavior. Part of what happens if you're planning, leading, organizing, controlling the work of others, you're trying to direct that. If you're trying to get people to follow you, you kind of have to stay on track. If something's going to happen where you have to change tracks, you might have to address that. But this idea of, where people could just bounce off the walls and still be an effective leader, it probably isn't going to happen. I've seen some situations where I could say, okay, this happened with a charismatic leader where they were a little bit inconsistent first, then finally found their mark. And once they were consistent, they actually became an effective leader. Defensive about failure. I'll tell you somebody who really illustrates the opposite of this. I work with Tillman Sheets. Something goes wrong or Tillman makes a bad call, he's very open and honest about that. So that's just about everybody I work with. Where, and you could say, okay, well, they're tenured, they're not going to lose their job. Well, no, these basically, what I've seen with the people I've worked with, they were like that before they were tenured. And a lot of good people I've known. My supervisor, when I was working for the state of Wisconsin, Bob Lavinia, one of those people where he's put in a situation where he has to read the external environment and have to make strategic decisions for us within that work unit. And sometimes making the wrong call, and then just being open and honest about it in terms of, okay, this happened, this wasn't the best call, I could have made a better call or whatever. So not being defensive about failure. If you think about that, do you really want to follow, or do you want somebody to lead you who's always making excuses? Now, if the excuse is I'm not psychic and this happened, I think that's legitimate. On the other hand, situations, and where I've seen this happen in workplace settings is people who are in leadership or management positions, something goes wrong and they blame it on the subordinate employee. And I think that's kind of problematic because, if you're really going to lead or manage and you made the decision, the buck has to, Harry Truman, the buck stops with you. Successful, calm people with good interpersonal skills. Again, extroversion helps, but if you can't be extroverted, be good at working, interacting with other people. Confident. Now, again, the confidence isn't going to be arrogance. It isn't going to be, I can do no wrong. But being comfortable with the role, being comfortable with what you're doing, because the other thing with confidence is it's going to project onto the people that you're leading, and people are going to more likely to kind of probably follow somebody who projects a little bit of confidence. Now, again, not confidence where they're going to say that they can't make a mistake, but confidence that, okay, we looked at everything we could, and this looks like the best course of action, so come on, let's all get involved with this. Predictable. Again, consistency. If you're trying to lead other people, and let's say we can also define that leadership in terms of managing other people, which comes down to planning, leading, organizing, and controlling the work with other people. Well, it helps if how you're behaving, how you're interacting, and even how you're thinking becomes predictable or consistent. Now, again, that's not being so overly predictable that something changes. You don't change with it, but it's the idea of trying to be the same person, heading the same direction on a daily basis. Now, admitting mistakes. Anybody that's in a leadership position that I've seen that was really effective. Again, I've got a couple of former supervisors that kind of illustrated that. Being honest, and this is what happened. This is what went wrong. I should have made a different decision. Or, sorry, y'all, I've kind of messed this up. We're going to have to regroup. I think that goes a long way with respect to not letting that situation derail. I mean, among other things, you think about that somebody's being open and honest, owning something, you're more likely to have confidence in it. Cover up and blame. I've seen people accept responsibility for stuff and lose jobs, but I've also seen them step back in and get back on track, get back on the career track with whatever they were attempting to do or whatever area they were working in. Lack of learning orientation. That's going to be kind of a fatal flaw in the 21st century because nothing is going to remain consistent. So this idea of, well, I don't have to learn, I don't have to take information from the internal and the external environment, I don't have to monitor changes, I don't have to change my behavior and adapt because I'm a know-it-all. It's going to become kind of problematic. Focused on self-advancement. One of the things we kind of find with effective leaders is they might be focused on self-advancement, but they're also really effective leaders at high levels of organizations tend to be somewhat altruistic, or they're not only interested in their own outcomes, but they're interested in everybody's outcomes. And I think that the other problem with focusing on self-advancement, this kind of goes along with being the narcissistic type, where people are eventually going to see it, and in some cases, people aren't going to follow you. Learning orientation, certainly in the 21st century. With organic organizations sometimes get referred to as learning organizations because they've got some kind of good knowledge and skill base, but things are changing, so they're starting to, they're picking up ideas and new skills as things go on. Focused on tasks and subordinate needs. So the person that's going to be effective in most leadership positions is going to say, okay, what is it that needs to happen here, and what is it that my subordinates need to make that happen? Whether it's anything from materials to supplies to information to encouragement or whatever. interpersonal skills versus strong interpersonal skills. Again, kind of like the stress tolerance, tolerance with ambiguity. I think these are things that can be developed. You know, chances are that the person that's going to step up right away and have the strong interpersonal skills might be the extroverted person. However, introverted person, people can develop the skills. And you know, make this clear that somebody who's an extrovert doesn't always have strong interpersonal skills. You know, I think we've all met these extroverts where you know, they were certainly happy and energized talking to people, but they wanted to talk about themselves. They wanted to talk about talk to people in ways where they were not considering the other person. So that the next point, insensitive versus sensitive. You know, being sensitive in terms of the needs of your employees, with respect to interacting with employees. Are you able, again, I'll go back to, are you able to interact effectively with diverse people and interact with people in a manner that fits their style or fits their expectations? There's some, I'll throw out another thing. There's, you know, we all know what the golden rule is. There was the, one of the business writers had something called the platinum rule, where part of it was treating people as they deserve or expect to be treated. Technical skills versus technical skills with situational specific, situational experience. This idea that, you know, you have the hardcore skills, but you know when to modify the skills or how to apply the skills across different situations. So again, you know, kind of looking at this from the perspective of, okay, things are dynamic. Changing the 21st century, so the successful person is going to have these things that would help them change or adapt with the other people to change, adapt with respect to what's happening with either the customer base, the external environment, or internal processes that are related. Now, the limitations of their approaches. This is what I was talking about. Not theory guided. In other words, if we say that, you know, again, conscientiousness seems to predict, to a certain degree, seems to predict a leadership ability, we haven't really examined the explanation. And good theory should give you a really good explanation in terms of why things are happening. Now, again, why this is probably not happening, this area is growing, leadership is sort of a complex area, and you know, growing and changing in ways to where it's happening quicker, the researchers can study it. The idea of linear relationships, and this is what I was referring to before, where historically we had looked at more as being better, and that traits are also going to predict in a single direction. And we have a whole lot of evidence in the 21st century that some things we're going to run into situations where more isn't better, or where one trait only works a certain way in combination with another trait or some kind of competency. Single traits and simple skills, we've kind of taken things and we try to simplify the things. In other words, you know, talking about how the need to achieve influences leader outcomes, or how cognitive complexity relates to leader outcomes. So, and part of, if you see what's happening here, and think about this in terms of science, part of what's happening here is science tries to simplify things. Well, we might be dealing with stuff where you cannot simplify to a certain degree. So in other words, again, if we're saying that people that have different skill sets and different levels of traits could be similarly effective, it kind of washes out the idea that we should also be looking at one single trait. I mean, we can examine a single trait or skill in terms of how much impact it has with respect to leader outcomes, but you know, in terms of saying, okay, this is going to be a broken explanation, how it's going to work. Lacks contextual balance. In other words, identifying under what situations, what contingencies do traits or different combinations of traits work the best. So, like I said, relatively short presentation tonight. Let me pull open the out of class activity. Get to the right week. I thought some of this would be kind of interesting, just to take a look at some of the historical perspectives, or to get another perspective on this, or some other ideas presented that kind of summarize some of this stuff. So, kind of one of the overarching things we have going on, too many leadership theories, and why so many leadership theories, and which one is correct, and David Denatz will give you about an 8-minute summary on his perspective on that. Some of the things that I think are important for anybody to know, us like going back and looking at history, because history tells us a lot of times, if it's in psychology or science or business and management, it kind of tells us why we do things the way we do. And sometimes, we can reflect back on what happened previously and actually find that we can take older ideas, we can adapt them to these situations. Some of the older ideas and some of the things that can kind of form the basis of what we mentioned. Classical management theory, good example of what happens because of the Industrial Revolution, how that influences how we lead and manage people in work settings. The point I keep making is that about bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on the situation and setting. A little background on that. Max Weber, however you want to pronounce that, came up with the idea. It was a big step up because it systematized work, had division of labor, made things quicker, more efficient, and more consistent. So it was kind of good from on that perspective. Henry Fayol, and I'm probably mispronouncing the name, engineer, and we've got a couple engineers here. We have Henry Fayol, and we have, let's go down here, Frederick Taylor. So a lot of this, in terms of management, there's a lot of influence of engineering. We have to think about that. What is it that engineers typically do? Well, engineers take a look at, regardless of whether it's mechanical or electrical, they're looking at processes. So if you can take their way of thinking and adapt it to, how we lead or organizing people, it makes sense. I think everybody's familiar with Maslow's hierarchy. Probably discussed that in some kind of general psych class or social psych class. And then McGregor's theories, X and Y. Theory X, kind of the pessimistic theory about what motivates people. I've met a lot of people that were managers or business owners over the years that subscribed to Theory X. And kind of the perspective was that the only two things that motivate people are fear and greed. So that's what you build into a work environment to get maximum performance. The one thing I could say about the people that were entrepreneurial and held to Theory X is the businesses just did not grow. On the other hand, I've watched people start businesses or more, if you want to break it down to McGregor's terminology, more Theory Y. Those were the people that started businesses that grew. And, again, we said that one thing that could happen with an entrepreneurial business, it starts to grow and takes a different set of leadership skills. So what happened was the person that started the business remained on as like a board owner or a chairman of the board, but they had to bring in a different management team to pick up and redevelop some of this management styles. Or you're looking more at the big picture and not controlling all the details, and working on ways to socially facilitate and motivate your workforce. So I think this total of these are like 5 to 10 minute videos, so that can take up the rest of the time for tonight. But there's assignment 2. I'll get the folder up shortly for that one. And what to expect after I stop the video is that this will get posted probably within an hour after it gets processed for YouTube by YouTube. So on that note, wish you all a good night. Hope you all are staying relatively cool wherever you're at, and hopefully we don't see things. Let's hope that August isn't any worse than what this is. Good night, y'all.